Okay, so privacy-enhancing consent-based digital credentials. First off, I'm Michael Shea, Managing Director of Wider Team, which is a technology consulting organization, particularly focusing on high assurance identity, not so much in the person space, but also in the organization and thing space. Which is really different with some of the things that are going on, particularly with some of the self-sovereign identity, decentralized identity, verifiable credential space, as compared to the terms. I'll let the rest of the panelists. Kaija, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Kaija Kirch. I'm head of Digital Identity Technologies Department at the Estonian IT company Cybernetica. And Cybernetica is one of those companies that's been behind Estonian digital services, e-government services, and at the moment we are working quite a lot on data exchange and digital identity, and we also have a research institute within our company. So one of the new initiatives for us is to create a researchers group who will focus solely on digital identity, because the scenery is changing a lot, and that's quite interesting for us.
I've just been speaking, so...
Yep. Michele?
Yeah, no. My name is Michele Nati. I work with IOTA Foundation. I'm the head of Telco infrastructure development. Obviously, telecommunication, they deal a lot with identities, as well as I'm running different projects. And yeah, I've been in the space for quite some time now. Actually, first, I was mainly focusing on the consent side, that I think is something that we will discuss later.
Okay. So, in designing a digital identity architecture, what's the, particularly, and John, you touched on it earlier in your presentation about DLTs, are DLTs required? I mean, I would pick a nit a little bit, specifically within the W3C credential standards, or the DLT actually isn't mentioned. And I think that was done very intentionally because they were concerned about people just rejecting it outhand, that's verifiable credential registry versus repository versus DLT. Are DLTs needed?
Anil John from DHS has a great flowchart. Do you need a blockchain? Mm-hmm. It's about an 8-step process, and at the end of the day, between various databases, PKI infrastructure, the use case where a blockchain is actually a necessity is a low percentage of use cases, I mm-hmm. think. That doesn't mean that some form of verifiable assurance isn't required, and a lot of that will be based on PKI or cryptographic assurances. So DIDCOM compliant with VCs gets you a lot of the way there. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying there aren't use cases where it's necessary, especially if you have transitive trust where multiple stakeholders have to in a big supply chain of identity data need access to that, but it's not a necessity.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I don't want to be. I work for a DLT company, so I would say that it definitely plays a role, yeah. And can do without. But I think we should have asked this question already when we built COVID Pass. Yep. Yeah, some time ago. Yep. We didn't. So yep. Somebody tried to push the use of DLT as underlying infrastructure for PKI for COVID Pass. And what is the result? Now I can go to Italy, where I'm coming from, with my COVID NHS, whatever credential or app. It's a very cumbersome process. So I would say that definitely will help with the integration, will simplify integration, increase interoperability. Having all identities transacting on a distributed ledger remove this central point of trust, let's say, that will mm-hmm. increase much more mobility of this credential, in my opinion. So I think can be not used, but will require a lot of integration effort if you want to see a global decentralized digital identity for people.
And you mentioned the COVID pass, because I don't know how many people have seen the last few weeks, there was this issue about COVID credentials showing up, European COVID credential, Green Pass credentials for Mickey Mouse and other personalities. And there's the big question around how it's been currently architected is things like revocation or key rotation. How important is that then? Those elements. We haven't really talked a lot about things like revocation or key rotation.
Sam Smith should be here.
Yeah, I know. So.
Yeah, I think it's really important. If you build any kind of digital identity system or identity system at all, there needs to be some sort of life cycle management because it concerns people and things happen into people's lives. So there needs to be definitely the element of revocation, but perhaps also some sort of track record of how long the credentials will be valid and things like that. So the lifecycle management is one of the most crucial things in digital identity system.
Which is kind of why I push back against blockchain. It's cool technology, barring some environmental issues and other externalities, but small things. But when I do my consulting privacy work, you talk about personal data lifecycle, and the end of the life cycle is disposal and destruction, and the blockchain's forever, right? So you really have to carefully architect it for downstream consequences, right?
Mm-hmm,
So if you don't absolutely have to have endurance of the data that's written, then maybe you shouldn't be using that form of audit trail.
And then there's the element of crime always as well, because if this credential is there forever, then this person may not be around, but somebody else may be interested in taking advantage of getting access to that credential.
And sure, the primary use of Bitcoin, one would be forgiven for saying that Bitcoin is what enables ransomware, and that and given the consequences of ransomware, maybe that entire ecosystem could be disposed of and dealt with in other ways. I know there's a lot of police authorities and financial authorities that think that.
Well, picking up a few of the elements, that is true. I mean, we can build something that we think will make our life better, more interoperable. Credential can be used everywhere if the underlying technology is actually adding a lot of extra cost, especially in terms of energy. So, I mean, we want to be all sustainable. So I would say that not all the blockchain will be fit for this purpose. Some of the other blockchain fit other purposes, so we need to select carefully which blockchain, if you decide to use it, be the underlying infrastructure for decentralized digital identities. And secondly, and there are some, of course, and secondly, it's about, of course, the life cycle and GDPR compliance. We need to be careful on what actually goes on the blockchain, where credential lives, how we can revocate them. So, I mean, we have to think about that blockchain doesn't hold personal data anyway. So, and if we start with that privacy by design and principle in mind, then we probably succeed in how we design the decentralized credential system.
Yeah, so I mean, the person who is going to be sitting here is from the Sovereign Foundation, and I point out that Sovereign, based on Hyperledger and Indy, is a distributed ledger technology that isn't based on a public blockchain, but a sort of semi-private one where a lot of those issues have been addressed. That's one of the ways of addressing this. SOVRIN. Just Marta, you couldn't be here, but we'll get that plug in.
Yeah. Just as I'm also part of Sovereign as well, the head of one of the working groups on SSI and IoT.
I think their trust framework is meeting right now or something.
Yeah. Well, on that, Sovereign published back at the end of last year, around this time, the 12 SSI principles. How important are these, particularly when you get into areas of consent, enhancing consent-based credentials?
Friday morning, before I took my flight here, I was sitting on, I'm on the research ethics board for the Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto. And I've been on research ethics board for years because as a privacy person. So my job is usually to read consents. Consents in medical research, 10, 15, 30, 40 pages. Somebody sits down with you, goes through it. This is what we're going to do to your child. These are the risks. These are the benefits. Do you understand? do you consent? That's a meaningful consent. What passes for consent in terms of condition and contracts of adhesion on the internet? Not so much.
That's intentional obfuscation.
Yeah, so in the words, the immortal words from The Princess Bride, I don't think that word means what you think it means. So I'm all for meaningful consent, but what we typically call consent isn't. And so I'm going to say that's problematic. Right?
Is it different in the SSI, or is that independent of the technology?
I think that's independent of the technology, and I think there's an architectural element that's missing, because Alice is never going to be able to read all of the privacy policies, which are essentially warranties that protect companies. They're not warranties about your privacy, they're warranties about protecting them from data, until we get a fourth party, like an agent or an artificial intelligence or an entity like a bank that has a fiduciary responsibility to Alice, and that entity has the resources to make sure that Alice's interests are, I mean, in my data, Michael and I are both part of my data. We talk about information, my data commons. There's a researcher here in the UK that did something with bottom-up data trusts, Sylvia Delacroix. There's people so until there's that entity in the equation, somebody to stand up for Alice, I think consent is going to be a very weak read.
Well, yeah, I definitely agree that consent is an important part of the credential life cycle. And there's two elements, of course. One is should be accessible, like just has been said. So most of the times we are presented with terms and conditions that we don't read, that we just give consent. And this need to be re-engineered. This live completely outside of the blockchain world. This live completely outside of is verifiable credentials as sovereign identity, or it's my identity or my data for accessing any sort of platform. So, and the main issue is that so far consent and sharing personal data in most of the non-institutional use case has been seen as out of convenience. So I get this, so I give my data, and nobody reads this, and we have to change a bit this approach and this attitude.
Yeah, but it's sorry, go ahead.
And the other one is, and I've done some work in the past to make this more transparent, accessible. Some of the other work is about then be able to track consent, because if we get consent and then we are not able to track any more consent, we don't know actually what happened after consent has been given to an enterprise to use my data, and I'm not able to police that side, then it's completely useless again. So
how does that model even then work with regards to consent? When someone says, John, you showed your 3 pieces of identity, and so if those were all verifiable, some sort of digital credential, and you could pick the 3 elements off of each of those credentials that was actually required, what is the consent model there? How does that work then, then when you get into a digital exchange?
I think there's a couple of things there, right? When I buy an electrical device, I don't have to take it home, put my voltmeter on it, and make sure that I can plug it in safely. It's not going to electrocute me. If I buy a children's toy, my kids are too old, so I don't have to worry about whether there's lead in the paint. There's a whole variety of consumer safety regulations. The GDPR isn't that. Right? It's not a consumer. It still involves in a form of consent that's victim blaming and puts all the burden on the individual, and that's why it's cumbersome and generates all that back end cost for companies that do use consent and start buying consent tech and all this other kind of stuff. That's operationally heavy. So I think there's that element. We start to need to look towards consumer safety regulations for privacy. Then on the credential side, I think it's the interoperability. I'm a member of the gym, I'm doubly vaccinated, and it's me, right? And then I should be able to present that simply and painlessly. And because I'm choosing to present it, because I'm walking in a gym, in this use case, the consent is built in, right? It's implied, right? I want to work out, these things are required, I don't have to go in the gym.
Okay.
I think the consent-based data processing is sometimes overrated, because if we want to get some sort of services, then we give the consent anyway. It's not about negotiating with the service provider that, well, I won't show you my COVID pass or this other thing or my ID document. If I want to get the service, then I will present that data, and then that's not really consent-based data processing. That's data processing based on fulfilling some sort of contract that I enter into with the service provider. So consent in that sense maybe is not the right term. It is something else, and we normally are willing to give that data. And then to bring another example, there's a lot of talk about putting the person in the middle. So when I share my digital data, I should be in the middle, and then I should be in the control when I share the data, and I should be the one deciding to whom I give the data. But if you put that person in the middle, then normally the human being is the weak link in any sort of security process. So if the person is in the middle, they tend to make mistakes. I mean, most of us, when we send emails, we've done at least that mistake, sending wrong file to the wrong person, or in a lot of cases not sending the file at all. So if I'm in the middle, I tend to make mistakes, and even though I want to be really careful with my personal data, I may be in a hurry, and then I still provide the data too much to the service provider without having the actual will to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think in my enterprise practice as a privacy consultant, right, there's 6 bases for processing in the GDPR, one of which is consent, all of which are valid. Consent is the most operationally expensive, least reliable form of basis for processing. Now, my privacy advocacy friends, my people in my data, don't like to hear that, but that's just the truth, right? I work with a startup in the Bay Area that uses JSON LD-based contracts. We've got contractual basis for processing, which is much stronger, where there's actual mutual agreement and mutual control. For the technical people, the idea of personal ownership of data doesn't make sense, right? Because as soon as you share the data, there's some kind of control. So if there's ownership of shared data, it's on the edge in a graph network, not at the node, right? And so how do you control the edge is I think, the technical problem, and that's mutually, not exclusively. You don't cede control to an entity, and you don't keep it to yourself, because then you're a hermit living in the desert, right? That has to be on the edge.
Hermits living in deserts have a good life too, though.
Sometimes depends on the desert.
Yeah.
To be honest, picking up on what was just said and what you said, it's a very interesting case that I'm not sure we have an answer yet, and will be very tricky from a legal point of view, because now if I think about the self-sovereign identity, so me controlling my identity and my credentials, and then the ability now to see credential all different attributes that before was created for me from an organization, an entity, and now it's me managing them. Then I can start to combine, like you said, and present all of them. So now the issue comes where, what is the consent for those? And actually, I give more to the gym than the gym used to know before, because I'm giving my license, I'm giving my membership, I'm giving other things that the gym doesn't know before. So what is now the right of the gym to manage this information, or to create a consent for the, let's say, combined information rather than the single information? And brings back to as well the topic of ownership. I'm owning now this information, this credential, and the combination of them that add value. Can I dispose and use the way I want, or I still have some limitation with my issuer in deciding where to go?
It depends if you check the checkbox.
Yes. It's not that easy. I mean, the selective disclosure or combining attributes is very powerful, but yeah, I'm thinking that will add a bit more headache from a legal point of view.
I'm about to commit sociology, but I'm going to recommend that people look up communications privacy management theory. There's a Wikipedia entry. It's from sociology where they talk about, for the human-centric view of what privacy means. And it's about selective disclosure. And there's rules-based, and it actually could be converted to technical systems and architectures relatively straightforward, but not a lot of technologists understand that technology is a social science as much as it is a hard science. Too many people still think, as a programmer friend of mine 30 years ago said, well, it was hard to write, it should be hard to use.
Yep. Is there any questions from the floor or online, Laura? Okay. Anything, I mean, otherwise we'll keep going. I just wanted to make sure that we're not, leaving anybody out, if anyone has a question.
You keep going.
Okay, all right. How then, when it comes into the presentations and the things like zero knowledge proofs or selective disclosures, the other names that it goes by, how is the concepts behind it is that then you're not actually turning the data over, that it's a question that's being asked and that you're fulfilling, so to use your club membership again as the sample, those three pieces of information are taken, but it's a cryptographic question that's been asked, so that it just resolves as, yes, you have all three pieces, therefore you have access, and that's not actually surrendered. How does that hold? How does that?
I think I'd be interested in hearing the Estonian response to that question, because you had some rocky times with your digital, the Estonian digital ID, but I think you've gotten a lot farther along the path. That might be.
Well, Estonia has a lot of experience in digital identity. We also have different types of technology, and but to come to your question, I'd like to kind of turn it around.
Sure.
And when we think about it from another angle, is that well, me. Of course, I want to use my identity, I want to present my credential. When I go to gym, I present my data. But at the same time, I don't want you to use my name and my identity and do the same thing. But the other side of that story is, if somebody still goes on and uses my identity and acts on my behalf, how do I then find out if I'm in control of the data and nobody has the right to collect that data? So, for example, the new EIDAS regulation, or the amendments to the EIDAS regulation in the EU say that when this new EID wallet is created, then nobody should store the transaction data, which is fair enough. I don't want anybody to track my activities. But at the same time, again, coming back to fraud, when somebody commits the fraud, then how do I find out about this? How is the law enforcement able to investigate if something happens? So there should probably be some sort of zero knowledge proof, some sort of element which enables still this investigation of identity fraud, because most of the discussion at the moment when it comes to self-sovereign identity tends to be on the side that I'm in control of my data, nobody should track me, which is all very valid points. But at the same time, I still want this society to operate the same way it has been operating so far, and I kind of expect that everybody is not as honest as I want to be. So there should be some sort of element to investigate identity fraud.
Well, sure.
No, go.
The physical analog is my wallet. I won't haul it out again. But if I want to get into the club, the club has everything. So, well, no, you can't. I can print out a business card, and say, well, here, I am who I say I am. And the club's got every right to say no, right? So self-sovereign means I get to choose what to present. It doesn't mean I get to force it down the throat of whoever I'm presenting it to. The other party still has the ability to say that qualifies, that's a sufficient identity authentication layer and all that other kind of stuff. And one of the requirements, if it's a bank, if it's a financial transaction, a medical history, we have to keep a record of that for fraud and these other things. So self-sovereign doesn't mean I get to dictate. It means I have a certain amount of freedom of choice, to your point.
Mm.
Right, but yeah, I think you also hit on something I talked about earlier, which is that there needs to be something acting on the behalf of the user, because the poor beleaguered user is incapable of reading all of the privacy.
It's not possible.
You know, no, any
It's
more than
not
it's possible of testing the chemical composition of the toys or the electrical characteristics of the appliance. We're missing a regulatory environment that does some basic digital safety provisions where that relieves the user of the burden, because if it's being presented to me in the context of Estonia, I know that it's met a certain regulatory standard, or it's a bank, there's a back-end audit system that I can trust that my accounts are not going to be snarfled and taken away somewhere else. I think that's the missing regulatory piece, that consumer safety bit.
One of the examples from Estonia is that a few years back we had a security incident with the ID card, and there was basically a flaw on the chip, which would have meant that if somebody knows the public key of my digital identity, they could have created a new digital identity and started using it without me having any information about that. And the only way to find out about this would have been checking their transaction data and then checking what I had been doing at the same time. Yeah. It didn't materialize. We were able to bypass the security risk before, but it was a very severe incident.
Made for some sleepless nights in Tallinn, I suspect.
Indeed.
Now, my last point will be only those transactional data are important from a forensic point of view, but I'm wondering why we should treat this data differently from other credentials, because these are still my data, and these are still data that I should manage and should collect and should give access if then somebody requests for forensic investigation of identity theft or something like this. But the real question is actually, is the end user really able to manage all of this complexity? So understand really how to do that. And this brings
should they even be asked to manage that complexity?
No, exactly. So this brings us to another level. So whether it's education, whether it's about user experience, but I mean.
How many people have a password manager on their phone or on their, right? Yeah, not surprising in this room. How many of you have got more than 500 credentials on that? I know I do, right?
Probably not quite that much.
Just,
well,
it's insane.
Or have you seen the infographic on PayPal?
Yeah.
Has anybody seen the infographic of what you're consenting to when you check the checkbox on PayPal? Yeah. It's 600 organizations that you're consenting for them to share your information. So it's not. It is the consent model as it stands today. Doesn't.
Yeah. That was my point. Yeah. I call it exceed. You exceed to this because you're ceding control to another entity, and it's blind trust without the infrastructure to validate the trust in most cases.
Okay. I don't know, where are we on time? I know we're between you and lunch, so.
Okay, there's a question from a virtual watcher.
Yep.
What are the panel's thoughts on what is the relationship between government-provided credentials and something like a self-sovereign credential? Are those concepts at odds with each other, or is it possible that you can kind of have both? Any thoughts on that?
Want to go first, Michele?
I think yes, you can have both, and this all relates to self-sovereign identity. Is an identity that I can create, but with no value, possibly if I don't attach different credentials and different attributes that says that I am who I am. And these have different level of assurance. And of course, the government issue, when they become digital, they become in form of verifiable credential. They sit next to many other credentials that I can build on top of my self-sovereign identity. So, but there will be different use cases that will require some of them, that will require a combination of them, or they can even live without government issue identity. But I think, yes, government are already showing that they're going into the direction of merging with the centralized digital identities. There is the sample of European government try to understand what a digital wallet for credential will be, reforming EIDAS. So I think they will coexist together and they will open up different opportunities for the end user.
Mm.
I think it's a false dichotomy, the way the question was phrased.
Yeah.
A wallet or a credential holding a piece of software can hold self-generated credentials that I generate for myself, the same way I could print my own business cards, plus my national or my provincial health card, plus my driving license, plus my my club membership and all those other things. The self-sovereign, Chris Allen's original post on this was 2016, is more about the ability about me being able to choose what to present and the verifier being able to understand the level of assurance that goes along with that. So that includes both self-generated credentials, government-issued credentials, third-party credentials. So if it's done right, yes, the answer, I think.
A final
My answer would
Go
also... Sorry.
No, carry on, Kaija, sorry.
My answer would also be yes, there can be any types of digital identity systems. The most important thing is that there are certain rules and regulations to which this system comply, and that also builds the trust of the whole system, whether it's government issued or private sector issued. Doesn't really matter if there is a certain set of regulations and somebody is checking the compliance against those regulations.
Mm.
I have to say, I admire the people in the audience. The beer tent opened an hour ago. And it's still there.
Just squeeze in one more, as we've had one more come in as you've been speaking on an online platform. So Adrian asks, is it more about data minimization? So if we have proper data minimization, where service providers only collect the data they need to provide their service, then do we still need zero knowledge proof?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would say...
A short answer to finish with.
If I can jump in, definitely verifiable credential will help with data minimization and also avoiding organizations that don't have the infrastructure to protect my personal data, small and medium enterprise and so on and so forth, to provide me service based on a verifiable identity, a verifiable credential, without them holding that, leaving the larger ecosystem to produce this credential, giving back to me and me presenting to them and they act only as a verifier. So having that in mind, there will be a possibility to see less data being shared around, less data being collected, and less risk for small and medium businesses that don't have all the security infrastructure that is required to manage this sort of data. So yeah, definitely I will encourage toward this respect as well.
Fantastic. Well, as John said, we are now between you and lunch and the craft beer bar, which did open an hour ago. So thank you very much to the panel. That was a really interesting discussion. Thank you.